He thought he was just buying land, a rundown ranch in the middle of nowhere, a fresh start for him and his daughter, for just $1. But behind the broken shutters and creaking floorboards, something waited. Not a ghost, not treasure, a girl, and a door she never opened. What began as a desperate move would unlock a truth buried for decades, and a love story no one saw coming. If stories of quiet strength, redemption, and unexpected connection speak to you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what happens next. Now, let me tell you the story of the girl who never opened the locked room and the man who listened. David Marshall never believed in miracles, especially not the kind that came wrapped in real estate paperwork and signed with a $1 bill. Yet here he was, standing in the middle of nowhere, Montana, staring at a rusted iron gate that creaked like a warning as the wind passed through it. A hand-painted sign dangled crookedly from a nail. Quaid Homestead, Est 1893. The sun beat down on the truck's hood as his 7-year-old daughter, Ellie, leaned forward in the passenger seat, eyes wide. "Is this it?" she asked. David shifted the gear into park and studied the crumbling path beyond the fence. Beyond it, the land stretched endlessly, golden and wild, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. At the far end of the gravel road, a weathered farmhouse stood crooked but dignified against the horizon. "This," he said softly, "is where we start over." They stepped out, their boots crunching over dry gravel and weeds. The air smelled of sagebrush, wood dust, and the faint, sweet trace of wildflowers. For the first time in months, David felt something stir in his chest, something quieter than hope, but warmer than regret. He popped open the back of the truck and grabbed 2 duffel bags. Ellie held tight to her stuffed rabbit, the one with the singed ear, and followed close behind him. The front porch groaned under their weight. The door was old oak, warped at the edges and flaking with white paint. David jiggled the key, the one handed to him by a half-drunk land agent who grinned too much and asked too few questions. "You sure you want it?" the man had said. "It's been sitting vacant for years. 100 acres, big old house, no plumbing worth bragging about. We'll let it go for $1 if you sign today." David signed without hesitation. Now, standing at the threshold, he inserted the key. It turned too easily. The latch gave with a dull click, and the door creaked open like the beginning of a confession. Inside was dust and silence, the kind of silence that pressed in from all sides, heavy, expectant. Furniture covered in yellowed sheets loomed like forgotten memories, wallpaper peeled at the corners. An antique chandelier dangled above like a skeleton wearing pearls. Light filtered through cracked window panes, catching the dust motes like snow in a dream. Then, a sound. Footsteps. Soft. Deliberate. Upstairs. David froze. "Dad?" Ellie whispered, tightening her grip on his sleeve. He motioned for her to stay behind him, heart suddenly hammering. He wasn't carrying a gun, only a rusted toolbox and too many regrets. The footsteps paused. Then came a voice, calm, feminine. "You must be the new owner." David looked up. At the top of the staircase stood a woman, mid-20s maybe. She wore a faded gray dress, cinched at the waist with twine, and her dark hair tumbled freely past her shoulders. She wasn't scared. She wasn't armed. She looked steady, like someone who'd been waiting. "I'm June," she said. "June Quaid. I've been taking care of this place." David blinked. "You've been living here?" Her expression didn't change. "Yes. No one told me. They wouldn't have. Boone Carter doesn't know everything about this ranch." His mind raced. "Are you squatting?" She tilted her head, almost amused. "Is that what they call it now? I suppose you could say I never left. The house asked me to stay." Behind him, Ellie whispered, "She talks like the wind." June descended the stairs slowly, her bare feet making no sound. This house has its own way of remembering things. Some people feel it. Most don't. You might. David felt off balance, like he'd stepped into someone else's memory. I don't want to evict you, he said. I know. He glanced toward the staircase. One door at the far end of the hallway stood out, taller than the rest, with a black iron handle and a brass plate etched with words dulled by time. He couldn't make them out. The door was locked with an old padlock, untouched by dust. What's that room? June turned slowly. That room has been locked since the day my mother died. And you've never opened it? No. Why not? She looked him straight in the eye for the first time. There was no fear in her, only weariness and a strange kind of grace. Because she told me not to, not until the right person came along. David's throat dried. Ellie stepped beside him now, her hand still in his. I don't know what kind of mess I just stepped into, he said, half to himself. June's gaze softened. Not a mess, just a story that hasn't ended yet. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the property contract. It fluttered open under the breeze. His eyes scanned to the bottom. In fine, fading print below the sale conditions was a handwritten clause. Buyer accepts any attached memories on premises. He stared at the line for a long time. The wind picked up outside. The front door creaked slightly on its hinges, as if something unseen had slipped past it. And June whispered behind him. It never sold for $1 before. The house didn't sleep. It exhaled. David first noticed it on their second night, an almost imperceptible rhythm beneath the creaks of wood and shifting shadows. A sigh in the floorboards, a breath behind the walls. And June moved through it like someone who had memorized its pulse. She walked barefoot even on the cold floors. She knew which window latches stuck in the morning dew and which stairs groaned like old men. In the quiet, she hummed low melodies with no lyrics, as if trying to remind the house of a tune it once knew. Ellie, despite her usual shyness, had taken to following June around with innocent curiosity. She'd sit at the edge of the kitchen and watch her prepare tea from herbs she'd gathered in the field, or quietly hand her a book without saying a word. June never forced conversation, but neither did she ignore the child's presence. She simply included her, like one might include air or light. David had no idea what to make of any of it. That morning, he found June sitting on the porch swing, mending what looked like an old tablecloth. Her hands moved with practiced ease, but her eyes were elsewhere, distant, focused not on the fabric, but on something far deeper. Sleep okay? She asked without looking up. David nodded. The bed didn't collapse. That's a start. June smiled faintly, the first true smile he'd seen from her. That one belonged to my parents. He hesitated, then lowered himself into the old rocking chair beside her. So, are you going to tell me why you stayed here all these years? Her hands paused. I mean, there had to be a reason. You could have gone anywhere. A motel, a church, a friend's place. She returned to sewing. I had nowhere else. That's not the same as choosing to stay. June let a breath out slowly. You're right. I stayed because of a promise. My mother's last one. She placed the needle carefully in the fabric and folded the cloth onto her lap. Then she turned toward him. After my father died, my mother was never the same. She believed the house still contained him somehow, that it remembered. When she got sick, she made me promise I'd never open the attic room. Not until I found someone I could trust with everything. David blinked. Everything? June nodded. Her secrets, the truth, the ghosts, if there were any. He studied her expression. It wasn't mystical or dramatic. It was steady, worn like Riverstone. I was 17, she added quietly. She died in that room, I locked the door behind me and haven't opened it since. And all this time you never thought you could trust someone? June looked at him, her eyes unflinching. Would you, if the last people you trusted stole your father's legacy, ruined your mother's mind, and tried to bury you along with their lies? David didn't answer. He didn't have one. Instead, he looked out toward the field, where the grasses shimmered under the noon sun like gold in motion. She leaned back slightly, her voice softer. I thought I was keeping the promise, but some days, I wonder if I've just been hiding. Ellie appeared in the doorway, her rabbit tucked under one arm. June? She asked. Can we pick flowers for the table? June's expression shifted, lightened. Of course, sweetheart. Just stay away from the eastern fence. There's a badger hole that way. The girl nodded solemnly and darted off. David turned to June again. She doesn't open up to many people. Not since her mom passed. She's brave, June replied. She pretends she isn't. But she is. David looked down at his hands, the faint burn scars, the calluses from rebuilding what others abandoned. Bravery doesn't always feel like it. No, she said, but sometimes it looks like showing up in a house you don't know, with a child you love, and facing whatever comes next. They sat in quiet for a while. That night, the wind shifted. It came not from the west, as usual, but from the north, bringing with it a chill that slithered through the cracks in the old walls. Ellie was already asleep, curled under thick quilts with her rabbit beside her. David lay in bed, half awake, listening to the sounds of the old house settle for the night. Then he heard it. Scratch. Soft. Barely there. A rustle from above, like paper brushing against wood, or fingers trailing gently across a wall. He sat up. Another sound followed, a shuffle, distinct now, from the direction of the attic door. He rose, quietly slipping on his boots, and stepped into the hallway. Moonlight bled in through the window at the end of the corridor, lighting the locked door in a cold blue hue. The padlock still hung in place, untouched, but the sound was unmistakable. Coming from within, he reached for the handle and stopped, not because he was afraid of what was inside, but because, from the far end of the hall, June's voice came through the dark. Don't. He turned. She stood in the doorway of the guest room, wrapped in a shawl, barefoot and calm. Don't open it. David hesitated. There's something moving. I know. He looked back at the door. You know. She stepped closer. Her voice was a whisper. It happens sometimes. When the wind changes. June, what's in there? Her eyes shimmered in the pale light. Memories. Some heavier than others. Some that don't want to be forgotten. They stood in silence, the air thick between them. Finally, she turned to leave. It'll stop by morning, she said. It always does, if you listen. And just like that, she disappeared into the dark. David stood alone, the attic door still sealed, the mystery heavier than ever. He didn't open it. Not that night. But something had shifted, not just in the house, in him. The days passed not in rush, but in rhythm. David rose before the sun. He boiled water on the old stove that groaned like it remembered better days. He fed the chickens June had half-tamed over the years, patched the sagging steps on the front porch, replaced glass panes one at a time. Every nail he drove into old wood felt like a conversation with something silent, but alive. He wasn't fixing a house. He was convincing it to trust him. And in turn, the house seemed to whisper back, groaning less, settling more gently at night. Even the wind through the walls had softened. June watched it all quietly. She never offered instructions, but she noticed everything. Sometimes David would catch her, glancing out the window as he worked on the barn roof, her expression unreadable, a cup of chamomile tea cradled in her hands like a forgotten memory. Ellie, too, began to bloom in the stillness. She spoke more now. Not much, but enough. She picked wildflowers and arranged them in jelly jars. She laughed at the rooster with a crooked tail. She asked questions about the stars. David had always believed his daughter carried her grief in silence. But out here, silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like room to breathe. One afternoon, after repairing the pantry shelves, David stood back and surveyed his work. The boards weren't perfect. He was no carpenter. But they were level, secure, solid. Just like he wanted to be. That evening, as golden light spilled across the floorboards and dusk settled over the fields like a soft quilt, June brought out an old photo album. They sat together at the kitchen table, David, Ellie, and June. The pages smelled faintly of cedar and dust, time woven into their edges. "This was the last picture of all three of us," June said softly, tapping the yellowed photograph. It showed a man with calloused hands and kind eyes, a woman with auburn hair pulled into a braid, and a teenage girl, June herself, half smiling at the camera. "Your dad looks like the kind of man who didn't say much, but meant everything he did," David said. June nodded. He didn't believe in talking much, but he believed in land. In truth, he said the ground would always tell you who you are, if you listened long enough. Did he build this house? No. His grandfather did. But he rebuilt most of it with his own hands. David traced the edge of the photo thoughtfully. Ellie, sitting beside him, pointed to the dog in the corner of the frame. "That one looks like Biscuit." June chuckled for the first time in days. "That's Buck. He used to howl every time the train went by." They turned one more page, then another. Some photos had faded. Others were missing entirely, cut away, leaving behind only jagged outlines. "Your mom didn't like being photographed?" David asked gently. June's smile faded. "She burned some of them. After he died." She closed the album carefully. As she did, something slipped free from the back cover. A yellowed envelope, brittle and sealed. David reached for it, pausing. "May I?" June hesitated, then nodded. The glue gave way with a faint crackle. Inside was a folded note, a grocery list scribbled in old cursive, and something heavier. A brass key. David held it up. It wasn't like any key he'd seen before. Wide bow, intricate notches. The teeth had a distinct curve, like it had been handmade long ago. Worn, but well cared for. June inhaled sharply. Her chair scraped slightly against the floor. "That's not possible," she murmured. "What is it?" "That." She stood slowly. "That looks like the key to the attic." David raised his eyebrows. "You've never seen it?" She shook her head. "My mother kept it on a chain around her neck. After she passed, I assumed it was buried with her. I never found it." He looked back at the envelope. It was tucked behind this photo. He turned it over. On the back, in faded ink, it read, "Quaid family, 1985. Keep safe what others might forget." June sat down slowly. Her hands trembled as she reached for the key but didn't take it. I don't know what to do with it." "You don't have to do anything tonight," David said gently. "Or ever, if that's what you decide. I told myself I was protecting something, but maybe I've just been afraid." David placed the key on the table between them, not pushing it closer, just placing it there. "I get it," he said. "I spent 2 years after my wife died pretending I wasn't drowning, until one day Ellie asked if we were ever going to stop living in someone else's shadow." June met his eyes. There was something fragile there, something brave. "What did you do?" she asked. "I bought this place." June smiled faintly, then leaned back in her chair. "I don't know if I'm ready." "You don't have to be," he replied. "But you're not alone anymore." That night, long after Ellie had fallen asleep, and the house had returned to its usual creaks and murmurs. David stood in the hallway. The attic door was still locked. The key sat on the kitchen table, untouched. But something was different. June had started leaving her bedroom door open, not out of fear, but trust. It rained for 2 days straight. The sky hung low and gray, brushing the tops of the cottonwoods and turning the fields into a sea of whispering stalks. The old house groaned as it expanded and settled in the damp air. Its bones, remembering things, even the walls, tried to forget. On the third morning, just as the storm began to lift, David walked into the kitchen and found the key gone. June stood at the sink, still as stone, her back to him. The window fogged slightly with her breath. "She's ready," she said quietly. David didn't ask who she was. They climbed the stairs in silence. The wood beneath their feet creaked in familiar rhythm now, no longer ominous, just old. The hallway was narrow, lit by a single window at the end. The attic door stood like it always had, tall, black-handled, and patient. June's hands trembled as she slid the key into the padlock. The click echoed louder than it should have. David stood beside her, not touching her, just there. She turned the handle. The door opened with a sigh. The air inside was dry, but heavy, as though the room had been holding its breath for years. Dust swirled in golden shafts of sunlight. A rocking chair sat beneath the window, draped in a faded quilt. A shelf lined the far wall, books, old tin boxes, a clock that had long since stopped ticking. On the desk, a tape recorder, cassette loaded, unlabeled. But it wasn't the objects that drew them in. It was the feeling, the strange, aching stillness, like time had folded in on itself here and laid down to sleep. June crossed the room slowly, like she might disturb something if she moved too quickly. Her fingers brushed the edge of the desk, then hovered above the recorder. David stepped forward. "You want me to press play?" She nodded once. The click of the button sounded final. Then, a voice. Rough. Kind. Worn like leather. "If you're hearing this, then you opened the door, and I'm gone. That's all right. Some doors don't open until they must." June's breath caught in her throat. She clutched the edge of the desk, eyes wide, brimming. "I made some mistakes. Trusted the wrong men. I thought I could keep what was ours by staying quiet. I was wrong." David glanced at her. She hadn't moved. "The Maddox brothers wanted the land. They called it progress. I called it home. When they couldn't buy it, they tried to steal it. I refused to sign. That's when the accident started." A pause, then a shaky breath on the tape. "I knew they'd come for me eventually. That's why I left everything hidden here. Maps, deeds, journals, everything you'll need. Not to fight, but to tell the truth." The tape clicked off. Silence returned, thick and absolute. June moved slowly to the shelf and pulled down a leather-bound journal. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside, carefully sketched drawings of the valley. Topography lines, notations, geological symbols, a map of veins running beneath the surface. David leaned in. He knew where the ore was. June nodded, and he knew they'd come for it. Inside a tin box, they found deeds, handwritten, notarized, stamped with ink so faded it looked like shadow. They told a story no court had ever heard, a claim laid down by her grandfather, expanded by her father, and erased by corporate fraud. June sat on the edge of the bed. Her hands rested on the journal as if afraid it might vanish. David knelt beside a drawer at the foot of the desk. Taped beneath it was a yellowed envelope. Inside, a torn photograph, a surveyor's certificate, and a smaller notebook, thin, bound in cracked brown leather. He handed it to her. She opened it. Her father's handwriting filled the first page. For June, because some things are too sacred for courts and too fragile for memory. Her fingers turned to the final page. There, in simple cursive. You'll know the right person when they don't want to open the lock to take, but to understand. June stared at the words, then looked at David. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She closed the book gently. Everything I thought I was guarding, she whispered, was never the point. David stood and walked to the window. Outside, the sun had begun to break through the clouds, painting the hills in shades of copper and light. You've been living in a room of ghosts, he said. Maybe now. It's time to let them rest. She didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the closet, pulled open its warped door, and placed the journal, the tapes, and the deeds into an old cedar chest. Not to hide them. Not anymore. But to keep them where they belonged. Safe. Seen. That evening, the house was quiet in a different way. Not empty. Not haunted. Just peaceful. Ellie sat cross-legged on the rug, drawing with crayons. June helped David chop onions for stew, tears on her cheeks but from laughter this time. He'd told a story about the time he got stuck in a tree trying to impress a girl with a kite. Later, as dusk fell and the crickets began their song, June stood at the bottom of the attic stairs once more. David watched as she placed the key back on the hook beside the door. She didn't lock it. She simply let it hang. "You're not going to close it?" he asked. She shook her head. It's done its job. It began with a boot print. A single sharp impression in the dust near the back porch. Deep, fresh, and not theirs. June noticed it first, just before sunset, as she brought in firewood from the shed. She stood there longer than she should have, staring at it, her arms full of kindling, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't a print from her worn canvas shoes or from David's heavy work boots. And it certainly wasn't Ellie's. It was too wide, too clean, too purposeful. By the time David came around the side of the house with a bundle of fence wire, June hadn't moved. "Everything all right?" he asked. She pointed silently to the ground. He crouched, eyes narrowing. One print, then another, half faded near the corner of the house. They weren't random. They were following the wall. David set the wire down and straightened slowly. "When's the last time you walked this way?" 2 days ago, before the rain. That rain had wiped everything clean. These prints came after. He looked toward the tree line, the horizon bleeding into copper and rust. "Did you lock the barn?" June nodded. "I always do." He didn't ask why she sounded so sure. He didn't need to. That night, after Ellie was asleep and the lamps dimmed low, David quietly unpacked the surveillance kit from the box in the attic. It had come from his former captain's garage, a gift left forgotten after retirement. Simple, analog, battery-powered, the kind of equipment you didn't need internet to run. He didn't tell June right away. He just worked quietly in the dark, hands steady. One camera by the back porch, another under the eaves facing the tree line, a third tucked inside the old lantern holder above the front gate. Old houses couldn't scream, but they could whisper warnings, and he was listening now. The following afternoon, 3 men pulled up in a silver SUV that didn't belong on a dirt road. David saw them from the field, the shimmer of polished chrome slicing through heat waves. He wiped his brow with the sleeve of his shirt and made his way toward the house, instincts prickling. The men were already out by the time he reached the fence. Slacks, buttoned shirts, too clean for this place. One of them wore sunglasses too dark for the gray sky. "David Marshall?" the tallest one asked, stepping forward with a polished smile. "Mind if we speak for a moment?" David stayed behind the gate. "Depends on what you're selling." The man chuckled. "Not selling. Buying. My name's Barrett. I represent a private investment group. We're acquiring properties in this region. Strategic development. David's jaw tightened. We're not interested. You haven't even heard the offer. I don't need to. Barrett's smile didn't falter, but the warmth in his voice began to slip. We're offering 3 times the appraised value. Up front, no inspections, no waiting period. Cash if you want it. David leaned against the fence post. Why this land? Barrett shrugged, smooth. Future growth, open space, proximity to mineral potential. David said nothing. Barrett's smile cracked. Look, I'm not here to pressure you, but word is this property's got some history. Old mining records. Could complicate future claims. So, this is about minerals. Barrett didn't answer directly. Let's just say it's in everyone's interest to simplify ownership. Tie up loose ends. David folded his arms. There are no loose ends here. Barrett stepped back, raising both hands in a gesture of surrender. Of course. We'll leave our card, in case you change your mind. He dropped a business card onto the post, then turned, nodding to the other 2 men. As they walked away, one of them, shorter, stockier, paused and glanced up at the attic window. David's eyes followed the gesture. The man smiled faintly, the kind of smile that said, "We know." They left in silence. The SUV rumbled down the gravel road, dust trailing behind it like a bad omen. David didn't move, not until the car vanished. Then he picked up the card. It was blank on one side. The other read only, Maddox Holdings, and a phone number with no name. That night, David reviewed the camera footage. It was mostly quiet. Squirrels, wind, the occasional sway of a loose shutter. Until 2:17 a.m. Then, motion. A figure moved just outside the reach of the porch light. Tall, hat wide-brimmed, coat down to the knees, no sound, no urgency, just presence. He moved like someone who'd been here before, someone checking on something he already owned. David paused the frame. The man stood at the edge of the barn, face obscured, hat casting shadow, one hand resting on the door, testing, not forcing. Then he moved toward the house and paused at the corner, where the camera's angle barely caught him. Then he vanished. David rewound the footage, paused again. Something on the man's belt glinted. A badge? No, not metal. A tool. A soil probe. David leaned back in his chair, heart ticking louder now. They weren't just curious. They were mapping. Down the hall, June stood in the doorway of the guest room. Her hair was braided for sleep, but her posture was tense. "You saw it too," she said. David nodded. He wasn't guessing where to look. Her voice lowered. "They know what's under this land." He turned the monitor toward her. "That name, Maddox, does it mean anything to you?" She swallowed. "My father used to curse it in his sleep." David shut off the monitor. "This isn't about buying land. It's about erasing history." She said nothing. He rose and looked at her, steady. "I can't promise to stop them. But I won't let them blindside us." She nodded, but her eyes shimmered. "I've been afraid so long, I forgot what it's like to stand with someone." David touched the side of her arm, not intimately, just firmly, like an anchor. Then it's time to remember. June didn't sleep that night. Neither did David. While Ellie rested peacefully in the back bedroom, her rabbit clutched close, David sat at the kitchen table, a pencil in one hand and an old field notebook in the other, the kind miners used, waterproof and bound with rugged leather. He drew. Lines, arrows, pathways, not plans of attack, but exposure. "This land isn't a battlefield," he told June. "It's a story. They want to erase it. We just need to make sure the truth is too loud to ignore." By dawn, the house had changed. To an intruder, it still looked old, quiet, harmless. But it had become a trap. David had rewired the living room to connect a small solar-powered projector to a hidden switch behind the bookshelf. It now pointed toward the fireplace mantel. If triggered, it would light up with a scanned projection of the original mind map, complete with overlays from Thomas Quaid's journal. The audio recorder, restored with parts from David's old ham radio, sat behind a hollowed-out vent cover near the front hallway. The voice on it was unmistakable. Thomas Quaid, clear and steady, recounting how he surveyed the land, how the Maddox group tried to force him out, and how he'd buried the real deeds before they could find them. He didn't tell June everything he had installed, not because he didn't trust her, but because he knew that if this failed, she'd need plausible deniability. "Will it scare them off?" she asked. "It won't need to," David replied. "It'll show them they're not the only ones who know how to play this game." She watched him in the soft morning light, her face unreadable. "This isn't who I thought you were," she murmured. He met her gaze. "It's who I had to become." They arrived just past noon. This time, not in a polished SUV, but 2 matte black pickup trucks with tinted windows and no plates. David was already on the porch when they pulled up. He was dressed in jeans, work gloves, and a plain flannel shirt. He looked like any other rancher, but his stance said otherwise. The same man as before, Barrett, stepped out, sunglasses gone now, his expression colder. Behind him came 2 others, one younger with a clipboard, the other older, heavy-set, wearing a dark windbreaker and a wide-brimmed hat. Barrett approached the fence and didn't wait for permission to speak. "We're done playing games, Mr. Marshall." David didn't blink. "Good. So am I. You've been uncooperative. Our client isn't interested in dragging this through court, but he won't tolerate obstruction." "I'm not obstructing anything," David said. "This land is mine, bought legally, and I haven't seen any legitimate paperwork saying otherwise." Barrett exchanged a glance with the man in the windbreaker. The older man stepped forward. "I'm sure we can clear this up," he said smoothly. "We'd just like to step inside and have a look around. Historic records, survey materials, anything relevant." David smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Funny," he said. "You didn't seem so interested in history last time you came by. Just numbers." The man's jaw tightened. David stepped off the porch, slowly, walking toward the gate. "You think because this place is forgotten, it's vulnerable. That because the house leans and the paint peels, no one's here to defend it." He stopped inches from Barrett. "But this place remembers, and so do I." Barrett's nostrils flared. "You're bluffing." David reached behind the fence post, pressed a small toggle hidden beneath the rusted lantern bracket. Inside, the projector lit up. Through the front window, the men could see the wall blaze with a projected image, detailed topography lines, vein routes, drill points, coordinates, a complete mineral map. "Recognize that?" David asked, his voice quiet. "Because a county judge will." Barrett's shoulders stiffened. The younger man with the clipboard moved slightly behind him. David didn't stop. "And in case you're wondering where it came from," he reached into his back pocket, pulled out a small speaker, and pressed play. Thomas Quaid's voice filled the air. "This land belongs to my family. They can forge whatever papers they want, but I've got the originals. And if something happens to me, I want the world to know who did it." The recording ended. Barrett's expression cracked for the first time. The older man looked uneasy now. He turned toward the truck. Barrett snarled, "This won't hold up in court." "I don't need it to," David said. "I just need it to make enough noise that your client wants to slither back into his hole." He stepped closer. His voice dropped, firm and low. "I lost someone I loved because I stayed quiet when I should have fought. I'm not making that mistake again." Silence. Heavy. Charged. Barrett turned without a word. He motioned to the others. They got into the trucks. David watched until the dust kicked up from their tires disappeared down the road. Inside, June stood in the living room, hands clasped in front of her chest. Her eyes shimmered. "You didn't just protect the house," she said. "You protected my father's voice." David looked at the still glowing projection on the wall. "No," he said softly. "You did. You just needed someone to carry it loud enough." She stepped toward him, paused, then reached out and gently touched his arm, her voice steady. "You're not the man I expected." David smiled, faint but true. "Neither are you." The attic door was no longer locked. It stood ajar now, its creaky hinges and worn wood no longer guarding secrets, but breathing air again, like a wound finally allowed to heal. But June didn't go up there that morning, not to the room. She went instead to the front porch, wrapped in her father's old denim jacket, a yellow legal pad pressed to her chest. The sky was soft with clouds, the kind of morning that wrapped the world in silence, not from fear, but from readiness. David saw her from the kitchen window. He didn't call out. He knew what this was. She had started to write. It had begun the night before, after the men drove away, after the projection faded and the recording stopped. After David sat in silence, elbows on the table, staring down at a half-empty cup of coffee gone cold. June had walked in from the hallway then, barefoot, quiet, something unreadable in her face. "I've spent years trying to keep this place frozen," she said, as if time would forget me if I didn't move. David looked up at her. "But you reminded me," she continued, voice trembling slightly, "that silence isn't always safety. Sometimes it's just another kind of prison." She walked over, laid the recorder down in front of him. "Tomorrow," she said, "I start telling the truth, out loud." And now, she did. Her handwriting was neat, pressed and sharp, the way her father had taught her, to make words with intention, not decoration. "My name is June Quaid. I am the daughter of Thomas Quaid, the man who built this home, and the woman who was silenced by fear. This is the story of what was taken from us, and what we refused to surrender." She wrote until her fingers cramped, until the lines blurred, until her heart stopped echoing in her chest like a trapped bird and started to breathe again. She wrote of deeds forged, threats whispered, the night her mother burned every legal document they had, because some truths are more dangerous than lies. She wrote of the day her father left and never returned, and how the last thing he ever said was, "Don't open that door unless you know who you are without it." June paused. She looked up at the house, this house that had aged with her grief, and saw it differently for the first time. Not as a grave, but as a witness. Ellie found her hours later, still on the porch, still writing. The little girl climbed the steps without a word and sat beside her. June had always kept a gentle distance from the child, polite smiles, careful nods, never more than that. She had convinced herself it was for Ellie's sake, that a woman who lived in ghosts had no right to share her light with someone still learning the world. But now, Ellie sat beside her, dragging a crayon across a coloring book with one hand, and leaning her head softly against June's arm. The contact startled her, but she didn't move. And when Ellie reached for her hand with quiet instinct, June didn't pull away. She let her fingers wrap around the child's, warm and real. It was the first time she had touched another person willingly in almost 8 years. Her breath caught. A tear slipped silently down her cheek, not from sadness, but from awe. Ellie didn't say anything. Children didn't need explanations. They only needed presence. Later that afternoon, David found June in the attic, not sorting, not hiding, but sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by maps and journals and photographs. The light filtered through the slatted window, casting gold across her face. She looked up when he entered. "I always thought this room was the thing holding me back," she said. "But it was me. It was always me." David didn't interrupt. She held up one of her father's tapes. "He told me I'd know the right person when they didn't want the key to open anything, just to understand." Her voice trembled. "You didn't ask to open this door for yourself. You opened it for me." David crouched beside her, resting his hands on his knees. "You opened it," he said gently. "I just stood beside you." She stared down at the mess of memories. "Do you think people like us ever stop feeling broken?" He considered that a long moment before answering. "I think we stop being broken the moment we stop pretending we're whole." She smiled, weak and bright. "That sounds like something my father would have said." He shrugged. "Maybe he did. Maybe he's still saying it. Through you." She leaned back against the wall and let herself feel the sunlight, the silence, and the presence of someone who didn't need to fix her to stand beside her. That evening, Ellie brought June a folded paper. On it was a crayon drawing, a house, a tall woman with long dark hair, a man with a beard, and a little girl holding both their hands. Above it, in uneven handwriting, "My family." June stared at it. Her fingers trembled as she touched the drawing. It was not blood that made it true. It was love. For the first time in years, June left the attic door open, not because she no longer feared it, but because it no longer defined her. They came when the sun was high and unapologetic, as if daylight could make them righteous. 2 black SUVs rolled onto the property, tires spitting dust into the air like warning flares. One bore the insignia of Maddox Energy. The other had government plates, official, intimidating. From the first stepped a man in a crisp navy suit with aviator sunglasses and a briefcase so polished it practically glowed. From the second came a local official in khakis and a windbreaker, trying far too hard to look relaxed. But it was the third man who made David's chest tighten. A tall, lean figure in a tight gray jacket, mirrored sunglasses, and a visible pistol holstered on his hip. A hired gun. Not law enforcement, not private security, just intimidation. They were no longer playing subtle. June stood beside David on the porch. She looked at the armed man, then at David. "Daylight doesn't make them less dangerous," she said quietly. "No," David replied, "but it makes them easier to see." The suited man approached the porch with a well-rehearsed politician's smile. "Mr. Marshall, Ms. Quaid." "Don't call her that," David snapped. "You don't get to use her name." The smile faltered for half a second. "We're here to resolve this situation civilly." "Civil men don't bring guns," David replied. The man in the gray jacket said nothing. He just stood near the base of the steps, hands folded loosely over the weapon at his side. The government official finally spoke, voice dry and falsely cheerful. "We've been reviewing the property deeds, and there seem to be inconsistencies. We're here to ensure everything is clarified." David nodded slowly. "And by clarified, you mean handed over?" "We have legal documentation," the suited man began. "That's funny," David interrupted, pulling a folder from under the bench behind him. "So do we." He handed over the file, copies of the original land deed, a notarized affidavit from June's mother, and 2 letters from Thomas Quaid's legal representative dated 1989. The suited man took them with forced politeness, his jaw working side to side. David turned to the local official. "You know this land. You know the Quaid name. What changed?" The man didn't meet his eyes. "Sometimes change is necessary." "No," June said sharply. "Sometimes it's bought." A tense silence. Then the man in gray stepped forward onto the bottom stair. "That's close enough," David said. "You going to stop me?" the man asked, voice cool and arrogant. "No," David said, his tone even. He is. He nodded to the road. The SUVs weren't the only vehicles approaching now. A dusty old sheriff's cruiser rumbled down the dirt road, lights off, but presence unmistakable. Behind the wheel sat a weathered man in his 60s, tan Stetson, sun-leathered skin, slow hands, steady eyes. Sheriff Ray Garrison. The cruiser rolled to a stop, and Ray stepped out, adjusting his belt. Well, he drawled. Didn't expect to visit this ranch again, but I heard someone's been playing lawyer with bad ink. The suited man stiffened. We're in the middle of a property clarification. Ray held up a hand. You're in the middle of a trespassing investigation and potential felony charges for document forgery, if half the things I've read are true. He pulled out a folded sheet of paper from his vest. Got a call from the county clerk. Seems a few land title transfers showed up recently, with signatures that didn't match anything on file. And a couple permits rushed through without full documentation. That's illegal, boys. The man in gray stepped forward again. Ray raised his voice. I wouldn't, son. There was something in his tone, steel wrapped in gravel, the kind of voice men respected or regretted crossing. The man froze. Ray stepped onto the porch, tipped his hat at June, then looked at David. It's been a while, Ray said. 10 years, David nodded. You saved my life in a wildfire outside Flagstaff. You remember? David's eyes softened. I remember the smoke. And your dog. Ray grinned. Still got her grandpup. Name's Josie. He turned to the men in suits. This land isn't for sale, and it sure as hell isn't yours to threaten. The suited man clenched his jaw. You'll regret this. Ray didn't blink. The only regret I got today is putting on these boots before they dried. Now get off this land before I add obstruction of justice to the list. For a few long seconds, no one moved. Then the Maddox lawyer snapped the folder shut, gave a curt nod, and turned. The armed man hesitated, long enough for David to see the hesitation behind his sunglasses. Then he followed. They left in silence, not defeated, but revealed. Later, on the porch, Ray sipped lemonade June had poured him. This place has been through hell, he said. June nodded. And now it's coming back. Ray looked at David. You've got friends in the right places, even if you didn't ask for them. David chuckled. Sometimes the best help comes when you're not trying to find it. Ray tipped his hat again. You'll be hearing from the DA. We're opening an investigation into Maddox's land acquisitions. Might get loud. Let it, June said. Some stories deserve to be heard. That night, David sat with Ellie under the stars, her head resting against his chest. They won't come back, will they? She asked. He stroked her hair. Not like that, he said. And if they do, we'll be ready. Together. The stars shimmered above them, silent, strong, and unafraid. And for the first time in years, the land itself seemed to breathe easier. It wasn't a grand courthouse, just a brick building with chipped paint and an old flag that flapped lazily in the Arizona wind. But to June Quaid, it was more sacred than any cathedral. It was here, at the heart of town, where generations of silence would finally end. David sat beside her in the courtroom pew, his shoulders solid and still. Ellie was between them, fidgeting with her small hands, her blue dress carefully ironed and chosen by June that morning. Outside, a few dozen locals had gathered. Rumors had spread quickly about forged deeds, land stolen under threats, and the quiet woman who had kept a promise to the dead for far too long. June clutched a folded piece of paper in her hand. Not her testimony, her father's handwriting. She wasn't going to read it. She had her own voice now. The judge, a woman with steel-gray hair and clear eyes, called the hearing to order. Representatives from Maddox Holdings sat at the opposite table, looking as stiff as their suits. There was no armed guard today, no hired enforcer, Just lawyers? And one public relations representative who kept glancing nervously toward the camera set up in the back. The county had opened the hearing to the public after Sheriff Ray submitted formal charges for document fraud, coercion, and unlawful land acquisition. But what brought people here wasn't just scandal. It was the return of truth. June stood slowly when her name was called. The courtroom quieted. She walked to the stand, held the oath steady in her voice, and began. My name is June Quaid. I am the legal heir of Thomas and Eleanor Quaid. For over 2 decades, I believed my voice didn't matter, that the only way to keep my parents' legacy alive was to stay silent, hidden, locked in a house and a memory. Her gaze lifted, not to the judge, but to the people watching. But I was wrong. Silence doesn't protect anything. It only extends the theft. She pulled out the original land deed, scanned and notarized, and held it up. My father didn't sell this land. He was threatened. My mother destroyed the evidence to keep us safe. But even then, she kept one truth alive. She told me not to open the attic until I found someone who didn't want what was inside. She turned, her eyes landing on David, who gave a small, proud nod. That person arrived. Not to take, but to listen. Then, June submitted copies of the maps, the audio recordings, and the letters between her father and county officials from 1985. The Maddox lawyers objected, of course, called it circumstantial, called it emotional, but the judge allowed every document. This court isn't just about what's legal, the judge said. It's about what's true. After the hearing, the judge recessed for deliberation. June stepped outside into the sun. Reporters pushed forward, but she didn't flinch. She simply walked past them, head held high. What mattered had already been said. A woman in her 70s approached from the crowd, holding a worn photograph. My husband lost his ranch the same year yours did, she said. He drank himself to death 5 years later, thinking no one would ever believe him. June's throat tightened. You've given us back our voice, the woman whispered. Thank you. One by one, others approached. Old ranchers, single mothers, people who had signed documents they didn't understand, who had been told their land was no longer valuable, but mysteriously bought the next month by energy companies. Each of them looked at June not as a victim, but as a trailblazer. Inside, Ellie clutched David's hand. Dad, she whispered, I didn't understand before. Why you helped her. Why we stayed. David turned to her, kneeling to meet her eyes. Do you understand now? Ellie nodded. Because it's not about winning, right? It's about standing with the people who were right all along. David smiled, a little choked up. Exactly, sweetheart. The verdict was delivered 2 hours later. All evidence submitted by June Quaid was deemed valid and legally binding. The attempted land transfer by Maddox Holdings was reversed. An investigation into fraudulent property acquisitions throughout the region was formally launched by the state. The courtroom erupted into quiet applause, not loud, not chaotic, just real, like something long buried had exhaled. That night, the porch was quiet. The air smelled of dry leaves and something deeper, like relief, like renewal. June rocked slowly in her father's old chair, a blanket around her shoulders. The stars above were wide and generous. David stepped out, a mug in each hand. They called me, he said. Who? The county. They want someone to help vet future land transfers. Someone who doesn't scare easy. June smiled softly. Let me guess. You said yes. I said I'd only do it if they called you too. She laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her really laugh. Then Ellie stepped out, holding her drawing again. But this time, she'd added something new. She'd drawn the courthouse. And on the steps stood June. Ellie looked up, eyes bright. You were like the hero in the stories you read me. June knelt slowly, placing a hand on Ellie's shoulder. "I just told the truth," she whispered. "That's what heroes do," Ellie replied. By spring, the desert was in bloom. The rains had come early that year, waking up the dormant earth like an old friend, whispering, "It's time." And for the first time in decades, the Quaid Ranch no longer looked like a house stranded in grief, but a living place with a pulse and purpose of its own. Wild fennel grew around the fence posts. Lavender and mint clustered near the kitchen porch. And in long, neat rows just beyond the barn, June and David planted star anise, Illycoium verum, the delicate, fragrant bloom her mother had loved, but never had a chance to grow. "This one's for her," June whispered, pressing the seed into the earth. She didn't cry. She just smiled. The attic door was still there, of course, weathered, familiar, unchanged in its frame, but no longer mysterious, no longer powerful. June had left it open for a while, not in rebellion, but in understanding. And when it was time, she would close it again. Not to hide from the past, but to honor how far she had come beyond it. The attic had once been a vault of fear, a space that whispered what was lost. Now, the rest of the house spoke louder. In the old den, bookshelves were filled again, not with secrets, but with stories, learning materials, and well-worn children's books. David and June had turned it into a small learning space for local families, many of whom had lost access to affordable education when the county closed the old library last year. Every Thursday, children gathered at the ranch, some with dusty boots and hand-me-down jeans, others quiet and uncertain, holding sketch pads or empty lunch boxes. June taught reading and history. David taught woodworking and survival skills. Ellie taught kindness without even trying. Sometimes the mothers stayed. Sometimes the fathers did. And sometimes the ranch just offered a safe place to sit in the sun and remember who you were before the world tried to take it. It wasn't a school, officially, but it was everything a school should be. One morning, June stood with her hand on the attic door handle, not trembling, not questioning, just ready. She looked out the hallway window. The sun was slanting golden over the fields, catching the dew on the new flowers. Behind her, she heard Ellie's voice downstairs, reading aloud to two boys from a battered copy of Charlotte's Web. David was sanding down an old bookshelf in the barn, whistling a half-forgotten tune from his army days. Life was no longer waiting for her. It was walking with her. She closed the attic door. The latch clicked softly. She rested her hand on the wood one last time. "I'm not closing you to forget," she whispered. "I'm closing you because I finally stayed." Later that week, Sheriff Ray stopped by with a box under one arm. "Found this in county storage," he said, handing it to June. "It was misfiled under a zoning permit. Thought you might want it." Inside were old photographs, ones her father had submitted when filing his original claim for the land, the foundation being poured, her mother painting the windowsills, a baby June sitting on a crate, chewing on her fist. But there was one photo that stopped her heart. It was the house. Before it had ever held fear. Before secrets. Before silence. It stood proud, whole, sunlit. And beside it stood her father, holding her mother in his arms. June pressed the photo to her chest. This land remembered. They didn't celebrate with fanfare. There were no grand openings, no articles in the paper. Just a Saturday afternoon where kids chased chickens and laughter floated on the breeze. A neighbor brought over 2 hives of bees. Another family donated an old piano. David built benches out of salvaged wood from the barn's collapsed loft. And June painted the attic window frame yellow. That was how healing happened, she realized. Not all at once, not with applause, but with small acts of choosing life, again and again. One evening, after the sun dipped behind the ridge, and shadows began to stretch across the porch. June sat alone with a cup of chamomile tea. The night was cool, but not unfriendly. She stared at the house, at the window that used to scare her when it creaked in the wind. Now it stood still, honest, familiar. David came up the steps and sat beside her. "You okay?" he asked gently. "I am," she said, then turned to him with a quiet smile. "I used to think I had to leave this house to be free of it. But maybe freedom was choosing to stay and make it mine again." He nodded, understanding more than words could say. Ellie opened the door behind them and poked her head out. "You guys coming in?" "In a minute," David said. She nodded, then paused. "Can I leave the porch light on?" June smiled. "Please do." That night, as the house glowed warmly behind them and the stars took their watch above, June leaned her head on David's shoulder. She didn't need to say thank you. He didn't need to ask what she was thinking. Some places don't just hold memories, they become them. A year had passed, and the land remembered. Not just in its silence or its shifting light, but in the way the grass grew taller, the flowers bloomed more willingly, and the porch creaked with a rhythm that no longer felt hollow. What had once been a house full of ghosts had become something rarer. A home that healed. By now, everyone in the county, and many beyond, had heard the story. The woman who kept a locked room for 20 years. The single father who bought a forgotten ranch for $1 and found more than land. The little girl who learned what courage looked like without ever raising her voice. The local paper ran the story first. Then the regional news picked it up. Then someone blogged about it, called it a modern American folktale. Schools started writing to June, asking if she could speak about standing up for truth. Veterans groups reached out to David, asking him to mentor younger servicemen starting over. But they didn't change who they were. Fame never knocked loud enough to disturb the rhythm of quiet mornings and tea at dusk. That April, Ellie turned 8. She danced barefoot in the garden, her laughter like wind chimes in the orchard David and June had planted behind the barn. The doctors had once feared long-term trauma in Ellie, delayed processing, emotional fatigue. But now she drew pictures, asked questions, chased chickens, and sometimes sat beside June in stillness, asking about her mother, about stories, about the old days. One morning, she came to David with a single request. "Can we visit Mom's tree?" It was what they had called the old oak near their former home, where he'd once carved her mother's initials. So they drove there. They sat beneath the tree in silence, and Ellie traced the initials with her fingers. She would have liked June, Ellie said suddenly. David swallowed hard. "Yeah," he said. "I think they would have liked each other a lot." That night, after Ellie had fallen asleep under a quilt June had sewn from old denim and flannel, David sat by the fireplace with a pen in his hand. He didn't write in a journal. He wrote a letter to his wife. "Mara, I didn't think I'd ever write you again. I used to think keeping your memory alive meant staying frozen in time. But this land, this old, wounded place, it showed me that memory isn't about preservation. It's about growth. I met someone who didn't try to replace you. She listened. She cried when no one asked her to. And she stayed, even when she was scared." Ellie laughs now, and I laugh too. I hope that's okay. I carry you in every sunrise, every moment I hold her. But I'm also letting life carry us somewhere new. Love, always, David. He folded the paper and placed it in the wooden box he once kept his army medals in. Then he closed the lid, gently, reverently. Some goodbyes don't echo. They just settle into the earth and bloom. The next morning was warm, washed in amber. On the front porch, a small table had been set. 2 coffee mugs, a vase with blooming star anise, and a single, freshly printed copy of a book. The cover was simple: white background, black script, a delicate illustration of a closed door surrounded by wildflowers. The girl who never opened the locked room, and the man who listened. By June, Quaid and David Marshall. June traced the title with her finger. "I almost didn't write it," she said softly. David reached for her hand. "But you did. And it matters." They sat for a while, letting the wind turn the pages to the dedication. For those who kept the door closed until it was safe to open, and for those who stayed outside, waiting, not to take, but to understand. David took a breath and looked at her, his voice hushed with a kind of wonder. "I used to think healing would feel like a triumph," he said, "like some grand arrival. But this—" He motioned to the porch, the land, the book. "This feels quieter." June nodded. "That's how you know it's real." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and for a long time they just listened, to the birds, to the trees, to the sound of Ellie humming as she fed the chickens. "I used to believe there were some things you could only bury," she whispered. David turned to her. "And now?" June smiled. Not sad, not nostalgic, just full. "Now I believe. The right promise never stays buried. It becomes something else. A garden, a story, a girl laughing in the morning." She reached over, laid her palm gently over the closed cover of the book, and added, "Some doors shouldn't be opened with a key, but with trust." They sat hand in hand as the sun climbed. And the land, this old, stubborn, remembering land, held them both in quiet witness. Where are you watching from today? We love hearing your stories too, so if this one touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Have you ever kept a door closed until someone earned the right to see inside? If you enjoyed this story and want more tales of kindness, quiet courage, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when a new story arrives. From our little corner of the internet to yours, thank you for spending your time with us. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and keep the light on.